welcome everyone. Fiona and I are here today, and we've got two guests with us, Tim Rideout and Ian Stewart, both from the Scottish Currency Group. I was just saying to you just now before we started recording, in my mind I had thought that it was last year that we had talked to you, because we talked to you, I think it was just after the Scottish Government brought out their economy paper. But actually, when I looked that up, it wasn't last year, it was 2 years ago. And I was just thinking, well, wow, because that's been that's been a rather big 2 years in terms of Scottish politics. If you think of everything that's happened, and none of it been terribly helpful, perhaps you could say. So maybe we might get on to talking about, you know, what your own perspectives are on that kind of 2 years. But we're going to start off, Tim. I think you're going to do this because you've got a conference coming up quite soon, I think. And do you want to tell us a bit about who's going to be there?
This is going to be quite exciting. I think it's the second conference that this currency group has organised, but the first one was online in 2021, and so this is the first one we've had in person. It's taking place on the Saturday the 21st, Sunday the 22nd of September at the Carnegie Conference Centre in Dunfermline, which is right next to the motorway, and also quite convenient for ScotRail station. So it should be quite easy for people to get to. It will obviously be online as well, so people who don't want to travel to Dunfermline can buy an online ticket. What the theme of the conference is a bit like John the Baptist. It's preparing the way for the Scottish Central Bank and currency. We've got quite a exciting range of speakers. I think the most exciting, probably, although people won't know that at the moment, is the fact that we've managed to get Professor Thibault Lorenjoy to come and talk to us about the currency plan for an independent Wales, which he prepared for the Senate. When I got sent this about 4 or 5 weeks ago, my first thought was I had no idea there was a currency plan for an independent Wales. But it turns out there is. And it's actually, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would put the Scottish Government's paper at about 1. And Dr. Lorenjoy's paper, I would give about 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10. Certainly knocks the Scottish Government's efforts into a cocked hat.
Is it as a result of the Constitutional Commission that the Welsh did?
It was instigated, I believe, by the Plaid members of the Senate. And I think the reason why it's not been publicised is because the coalition with the Labour Party came to an end. Yeah. So it sort of got a bit buried, which is why we don't know about it. They also did separate papers on things like joining the EU or EFTA. There's one on pensions and the finances of an independent Wales. And really, they've set out to answer the questions which the SNP Scottish Government has persistently refused to answer. You know, what's your currency plan, what's your EU plan, what's your borders arrangement, and what's the pension arrangements.
I think the interesting thing about the Welsh papers is they are funded by the taxpayer, and the Labour government in charge didn't seem to have a problem when it came to Wales. Whereas, of course, if the Scottish government tried to do anything in a similar fashion, funded by a taxpayer, every newspaper and every broadcast in Scotland would be covering it as being outrageous.
That's really interesting, because when Tim was saying that, I mean, I was just sitting thinking, well, wow, good. Presumably Plaid Cymru, you know, financed that themselves. Never occurring to me that it could have done actually by the Senate too. So
yeah, it was commissioned by the Senate, so it obviously had all party support to that extent.
Yeah, yeah.
The important thing from our point of view is that Dr. Lorenjoy is unequivocal. The worst currency option for Wales would be sterlingisation. And he says that if you are going to become independent, the only sensible choice is to have your own currency right away. So I think we can agree with that, because that's exactly what we've been saying since 2019.
Yeah.
So that's our first speaker on the Saturday, and
wow,
we've given him twice as long as most of the other speakers are getting, so that he can tell us all about that. We've also got John Eggleston, who was chairman of the Icelandic Central Bank from 2013 to 2017. And he's going to tell us about the 2008 crisis and how the Icelandic authorities dealt with it as a sort of lesson in what central banks can and can't do in a sort of emergency situation. Dr. Egilsson led the referendum campaign in Iceland, where the Icelandic people basically gave the finger to the UK and the Netherlands, who were trying to get Iceland to cover the debts of the Icelandic banks in the UK and the Netherlands. The referendum, Egilsson won it, so the Netherlands and the UK were told to get stuffed. Had it gone through, the Icelandic taxpayer would have been paying for the next 50 years towards that debt, whereas what's happened to it has just disappeared because it was in euro and sterling, and writing it off is not a problem for either of those countries. So that'll be quite interesting. An interesting story that John told me was that Gordon Brown instructed the Bank of England to confiscate the Icelandic Central Bank's foreign reserves, the sterling foreign reserves, which were held at the Bank of England, which they did. And the Icelanders got them back within 3 weeks. And
I think the other interesting thing about the Icelandic experience, senior bankers were held accountable and actually charged.
Yep. They were jailed, weren't they? They actually.
Yes, they were. They were jailed. So.
He got the reserves back by, or at least the Icelanders got the reserves back by saying that if they weren't returned, the supply of cod to Grimsby would stop. And the fish and chip business in the UK would collapse shortly afterwards. So,
the Icelanders! It's amazing, didn't it? Like, does that mean that they didn't really have very much in the way of currency reserves? It's a massive amount of cod that we import from them.
Well, most of the cod that you get in a fish shop comes from Iceland. It's either Iceland or Norway. We don't really have any ourselves anymore. So John Egilsson will be well worth listening to, I think. And then we have Malin Johansson, who's coming from the Faroes, and she's the chief executive of the Faroese Landsbanki, which is the state bank of the Faroes. Probably all going, how come the Faroes has got a state bank and Scotland doesn't? But they do, and it's not quite a full-blown central bank, but they manage the Faroese government's accounts, they manage its bond issuance, they manage the Faroes sovereign wealth fund, and they also regulate the 4 banks which apparently they have in the Faroes.
The Faroes is still nominally run by Denmark, is it?
The situation is it's self-governing apart from defence and foreign affairs, which are the responsibility of Denmark. They still use the Danish kroner, and the Landsbanki operates under, in collaboration with the Danish central bank in Copenhagen. But they, apart from the fact that they haven't got their own currency as yet, then it does a lot of the work of a central bank. So I think it would be quite interesting to see what Malin has to tell us. And obviously, the Landsbanki was quite involved in financing the tunnel system that the Faroes has, which they've spent about 2 billion euros on. Now, that's 55,000 people who've managed to come up with 2 billion euros, and the last island is currently being connected with the final tunnel, which is 23 kilometers long under the sea. And when that's finished, there will be no ferries in the Faroes because they won't need any. As I say, another exciting, interesting speaker. We have Richard Murphy, who's going to talk to us about how we can improve the tax system in independent Scotland. Robin McAlpine's going to come and address us on the politics and strategy around the issue of the currency and monetary policy, fiscal policy, so on, and how we get over the line. We'll have the Commonweal team talking to us about their plans for a Green New Deal and how, with the assistance of having your own currency, that can be financed. So I think there's lots to interest people. Last but not least, on the Saturday at the end of the day, we'll be having the Scottish currency game, where people get to change their sterling into the Scottish pound. And then there'll be a buffet and cash bar, which will not accept sterling.
I love that game. I can't remember. It was one Christmas that I think you were in. Was it Falkirk? You did an event just before Christmas, and I was at that one, and it was what an eye opener, because it just suddenly everything fell into place. Of course, we would transfer our sterling into Scots pounds, and you just explained how it would all work, and I thought it was brilliant.
What strikes me hearing that, Tim, is it just sounds so upbeat and practical, but actually also optimistic and international. And it wasn't exactly that I thought it wouldn't be kind of positive and upbeat, but it's just interesting when you get when you hear what's going to be talked about, and it just sounds a really, really good lineup of speakers that you have. And from your own point of view, from the group's point of view, what are you hoping to come from it, to come out of it, maybe?
Well, to demystify the issue and show that there's nothing peculiar about a central bank that Scots can't do. It's fairly simple to establish one and run it, and Scotland pretty much invented modern day banking, so there's no reason whatsoever why we can't have a central bank. It's also an element, I think, of trying to shame the Scottish government for their inactivity.
That was one thing I was going to ask you, which, that's the notable exception that's missing from your lineup. There's nobody from the Scottish government? Is Kate Forbes not interested in this?
Well, Kate Forbes is my MSP. I live in Isle of Skye, so I'm in her constituency. And I did ask Kate Forbes, I gave her the details, but she wasn't able to attend. So we have asked not only Kate Forbes, but others to attend, but sadly, we haven't had that engagement. But picking up on Tim's point regarding setting up central banks, if you look at the history of the British Empire, it was by and large it was Scots who set up banking in Canada. State Bank of India was founded by 2 Scots, and you'll find that throughout the British Empire, that Scotland can't set up a central bank and issue a currency in our own territory. It's frankly talking nonsense.
I mean, that lineup that they've got. It's just really attractive. I'm going to definitely try and get myself along. But well, certainly from your point of view, Tim, and I'm guessing it's probably the same with you, Ian. I mean, you've been banging on about this whole topic for 6 years now. Are you getting somewhere? Do you think you're getting somewhere with it? I mean, do you think there might be people like people like myself and Fiona, but also the kind of the folk who'll listen to our podcasts have got an interest in it. I mean, but do you think it's going a bit wider? And are you getting? Do you talk to the Scottish politicians about it? Are you feeling it's getting some traction? I suppose that's the basic question.
Not with the SNP leadership. I think we've had, as you say, 6 years of being sort of studiously ignored. I never spoke to Nicola Sturgeon. I've never spoken to Hamza Yousaf. Never spoken to John Swinney. So we did have a short meeting with Hepburn, when he was the minister for independence, which was really quite disappointing, because all he said really was that Currency Group was could do what they liked, and he would carry on taking no notice.
Ian Blackford also lives in Isle of Skye, and so I've had several discussions with Ian, both at branch meetings and on a one-to-one basis, but it's been very, very difficult to get engagement. They're very much wedded to the Growth Commission and the sterlingisation, and we haven't been able to move them from that position. They will say that they'll issue a Scottish currency, that's part of the Growth Commission, but subject to certain criteria and over a prolonged period, which could be out to 10 years. Now, the interesting thing there is you get Alan Smith, who, when he was an MP, was very forward at saying, oh no, we're going to join the European Union. And of course, given that the official policy was the Growth Commission having sterling for up to 10 years, and the European Union requiring you to be able to issue your own currency for a minimum period of 3 years, there was a total spoof. that we were going to join the European Union under these proposals anytime soon, because that's 10 years plus 3 is 13 years before you could even be considered to rejoin the European Union.
Yeah. It's as if it's, you know, you've got a bunch of, you know, intelligent people in Holyrood, but intelligent people, you know, they're as part of the SNP government there. But when I hear that, I'm thinking, well, it's like different pieces of jigsaw, and no one's thought to try and put them together and then go, oh, actually, that won't fit, will it? Because we'd need our currency at that point. And I mean, all the kind of information that's actually on the website that you set up, Tim, you know, about the timeline and everything. It just seems so odd that a sort of joined up thinking still doesn't seem to be happening.
I think this is one of the key objectives of the conference, is to build confidence, because in my discussions and a one-to-one with the politicians, not just the ones I've mentioned, they seem to shy away from the subject of currency, as if they'd rather keep it as obtuse as possible. Possibly they don't have the confidence to see themselves going in front of a TV screen and being analysed on the position of Scotland issuing its own currency. So part of, I mean, certainly for me as the convener of the Scottish Currency Working Group, Banking and Finance, part of this process is to build confidence amongst our audience and the wider movement. That, as Tim said earlier, it's not a complicated thing to issue your currency, but you do need to do the preparatory work. You do need to have the central bank, you do need to have the Treasury, and you do need to have the Financial Services Authority. But we could be starting doing that now, really. There's no reason why not.
Yes, that was things that I remember from I think from the last time we talked to you, just how much could be done in advance to get it ready to go. And it happens to be a couple of years since we've had you on the podcast, but a lot has happened. I mean, a lot has happened within Scottish politics, particularly the SNP and then SNP and the Greens coming together and then splitting apart again. But also, there's been other things, hasn't there? There was the whole Liz Truss debacle, and then subsequent to that, you know, in Russia invading Ukraine, which those things did send big tremors through not just the British financial system, but, you know, certainly in terms of Russia, you know, the whole world system. So do you think that somewhere maybe SNP politicians with that experience now are maybe even less inclined to kind of think about it? Or is that something that you think, say, if there had been a Scottish currency set up, if we were independent, I'm now saying, there'd been a Scottish currency set up. I mean, is there any reason to think that Scots pound would have suffered any worse than other currencies during that whole period?
No, and I think probably, you know, if we were a small non-aligned state, the way that Ireland is, for example, it might have had less impact. And, you know, one of the things of having your own currency is you can use it as a buffer against external shocks, because you can allow, you know, the value of the currency can change instead of the internal price level or the unemployment level or things like that. If you don't have the currency and you're locked into a shared currency system regime, or you're depending on sterling, you know, if the oil price changes, for example, then it'll impact on the price level and employment instead of a change to the exchange rate.
And of course, Ireland's got the euro, hasn't it? So is that a no-go area for you, the idea of us ever being part of the euro? Or?
You know, we could consider it in 20 or 30 years' time, but it's not you know, at the current moment, the euro is hardwired to create austerity because of the what I call the no growth and instability pact that Brussels has, which is things like the 3% deficit limit. You know, there's no question, I think, that you know, when we're starting up a new country and or at least restoring the independence, I try to stop saying that you know, we're going to be becoming independent. We're just restoring the independence that used to be there. Anyway, but you know, we are going to have to set up the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and these sorts of things. And that's going to cost money. I did some work a couple of years ago for SNP resolutions, and it could result in sort of 30 to 40,000 new jobs, for example. So it's a cost, but it's also people that currently work in London who would in future be working in Scotland instead. But does it involve a short-term cost to establish these things, and that's an investment in the future, and it means that the Scottish Government is almost certainly going to run a fairly large deficit in the first year or two after independence. So you don't want to go signing up to something which says you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah,
and we would be able to borrow then because we would be independent.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, the borrowing is rather sort of misunderstood area in that. Yes, the Scottish Government will issue Scottish pound bonds. So it will be, if you like, borrowing from us. But it's really just a savings mechanism for the citizens. The state is providing you with the Scottish pounds. You're not spending all of them. You're using some of them to buy a Scottish premium bond or a Scottish savings certificate or something like that. Is that borrowing by the state or is it saving by the private citizens? Well,
of course. Yeah, and it's this thing about having your own bank. We're so conditioned to this kind of household budget. Here's your little allocation.
I think a good illustration for you, Fiona, for your listeners, is had Scotland voted for independence in 2014 and had we kept sterlingization and COVID came along, because we're still using sterling, the independent state of Scotland would have had to borrow sterling, massive amounts of sterling, billions and billions of pounds of sterling, repayable by that time to a foreign country in a foreign currency, which would have dictated how we run our economy for the next 20 years, because we'd have to earn by selling our assets, selling our products to earn sterling to repay debts to London in sterling. Whereas with our plan to have our own currency from day one of independence, we'd be borrowing Scottish pounds from our own treasury and we'd be paying no external parties whatsoever. And as Tim says, after independence, we're going to have to rebuild the infrastructure of Scotland. I've occasionally called it a Scottish Marshall Plan, like after the Second World War, when Europe had to invest heavily to rebuild the infrastructure. We've lost so many industries over the last 40 years in Scotland that the value of our currency is to rebuild our industry, rebuild our manufacturing base and create jobs using the assets available to us in Scotland, our wind energy, oil, gas, and create these jobs, well-paid jobs for our own people, our own children and our grandchildren.
I'm just sort of thinking, Tim, you said you're going to have the Commonweal, Rob McAlpine, but also the Commonweal kind of team there at the conference. And if there's one thing they've got mapped out, it's how to do exactly that job, and do it from a very sustainable green way of doing it. I'm sitting here thinking, it sort of feels like, if we're independent, got to the point where the currency is set up, at that point you just kind of have to hold your nerve. And and keep heading in the direction you've got to head in, and not let yourself be blown too far off course by, it might be comments from other countries to the south of you or world events. But so, Ian, just to bring you in a bit more, what are you thinking about going forward from here? So we've had all this things going on in Scottish politics, but also world events, and maybe there's a bit of there's a lot of discussions happening in various groupings of people amongst it might not be the SNP in Holyrood, but certainly the Yes movement, coming up with ideas about where do we go next. And pretty clear that the Tories were never going to say yes to a referendum very quickly. I suspect that, it doesn't look like Labour's any better than that. So how are you kind of feeling going forward and what we might do?
Well, the first thing I wouldn't be asking for is a referendum. The days of asking for a referendum are over. One of the reasons why the Scottish Currency Group is running this conference is we are marking the 10th anniversary of that, where we almost did it. And it's important, and people are deflated. I mean, with what's happened in the SNP, the lack of leadership from the SNP has left us really in a bit of a quandary in the movement. I use the word movement as opposed to the SNP. But we in the currency group see ourselves playing a vital role for the next campaign. And it's not going to be a referendum. It's going to be through normal voting and through the civic society. One of the things we hope to do after getting the engagement of people interested in our conference is fairly quickly moving to talk to other parties like Scotonomics, Commonweal, Believe in Scotland, etc., and try to form, as close as we possibly can, a common position on issuing our own currency in an independent Scotland. We're pretty much close to it across these groups as we stand today, but there are 2 or 3 significant differences where we'd like to get more a consensus position. And we hope to do that probably in the last quarter of this year. And the reason we want to do that is because we really do believe that there will be a civic society movement formed in Scotland, probably early next year. And whether or not the SNP are there with us or whether they exist by then is really not the issue. The movement for independence is still with us. We've still got that support. And in the currency group, we are providing leadership in the area of our expertise. And we hope others will do similar in their own areas of expertise.
It's really good to hear that. And it was one of the things I was going to ask, because we talked to Gordon McIntyre Kemp. He was speaking, obviously he was speaking on behalf of Believe in Scotland about the proposal that that they're putting forward about it's being called the Scottish Citizens Convention. A little bit modelled on the Welsh Constitutional Commission, but also different and not specifically about independence. I mean, I think that will be a hard one to actually take forward, but, fingers crossed that something can come out of it. I mean, do you ever see yourselves, I don't know, just kind of going round different parts of the country, heading up to Oban, you're near Oban anyway, Ian, but, heading up to different parts of the country, hiring a church hall, putting on the kind of, things that bring Scots in for, cups of tea and coffee and scones and sausage rolls and stuff, and just talking about currency and, kind of like taking it out to people as well as setting up things like conference.
Yeah, well, certainly, it's not easy for me to travel around Scotland because I'm based in the Isle of Skye. So logistically, it has certain constraints. But I mean, I'm very happy to do Zoom meetings, etc. And I have done so with Skye and Lochal's Yes Group and Skye and Lochal's SNP. And, these work quite well, really, because you can actually do a Zoom presentation and then take questions and answers. And they work fairly well. A half-hour presentation, half-hour question and answers, you pretty much cover most of what you need to cover. And you probably get more insights into what issue in a currency is than you will hear from any MP from any party.
I've done talks in person, all the way from Dumfries to Stornoway, Aberdeen, Inverness, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stonehaven. So if there is somebody who wants a Yes Group or an SNP branch or a Green branch, or I don't mind go and talk to the Tory branch in Murray if they wanted. But we can certainly provide a speaker, but it's me or somebody else from the currency group, and do that sort of event.
Yeah, I suppose what I had in mind when I was saying that was it's not like trying to set things up that the message gets taken to places that it's not a Yes Group or the SNP, but maybe the Tory party in Murray. They're probably in a little bit of having a little bit of bother themselves at the moment. But I think it's the kind of thing that in the States gets called a town hall meeting, and it's just it's open, and anyone can go. It's not setting up something that's about an independent supporters group meeting, but just an open meeting. And of course, you take the risk that no one will come. But I suppose it's that kind of thing, because like somewhere or other we need to not just always be talking to ourselves all the time, don't we?
That's always a challenge, and we regularly get articles published in the National, and of course the National's a pro-independence paper. But in the last week or so, we've had articles published in the Herald, and also the Scotsman. And it's been very interesting to go online and see the comments.
Brave man.
Very brave, very brave. Not very many of them are complimentary. Very few are complimentary in these two papers, which isn't surprising. So, you know, what you're suggesting is quite a difficult thing to envisage, why a unionist would come along to a Scottish currency presentation rather than just come along to be disruptive. It's the middle of the road, the people who need to be convinced, not the hardline unionists. You know. And we know from voting that hardline unionists and conservatives in Scotland are, you know, about 20 or 22% of the electorate. So, you know, that's a sort of sector we can pretty much say we're never going to win over. But the rest of them, yeah, it's worth making every effort we can.
Saying all that, it's worth noting that the very second person to buy a ticket for the conference in Dunfermline was my dear friend Sam Taylor from these islands.
Wow.
It's my own personal stalker, I think, actually, the way
I don't think you're going to convince him, Tim.
See your sort of nemesis, Tim, you know.
No, but he you know, I've got him blocked on everything, but he still still finds out, and he obviously religiously searches for anything that the currency group may post or write or whatever. So, you know, even before we'd done an advert for the conference, he'd managed to get onto Eventbrite and buy a ticket. So we'll welcome him to Dunfermline.
Of course, yeah.
And you know, try and make sure that he doesn't get up to anything. He's obviously, his purpose is just to cause trouble. But what it does say is the fact that a very pro-unionist group like these islands make a particular point of following what we're doing and trying to cause all sorts of trouble. You know, they've had me on the front page of the Sun as a flag burner before now, but says that they realise that we have the answer to the currency question. It's one of the very few things that is holding people back. So you know, they are doing whatever they possibly can to prevent us succeeding in removing what Robin McAlpine calls an obstacle. You know, Robin McAlpine said there are 4 obstacles that need to be cleared out of the way. And one of those is currency. One of them is the European Union question. The other one's the borders. And the 4th one is pensions. And, you know, so once you've got rid of the obstacles, then you have to set out the vision for why you want to be independent. I mean, this is something that the SNP has also not been very good at. And I think the late Ian Lawson, who was a great supporter of the currency group, did a talk a few years ago in Dalkeith on his time in Estonia. And he said that one of the lessons that the Estonians had taught him was that when you achieve independence, so it's also worth making a point that in Estonia, it was the people that secured independence. The supposed Estonian Independence Party in the Estonian parliament turned out to be devolutionists who, you know, when push came to shove and it was, you know, are we going to be independent from the USSR? They went, oh, well, that might be a bit, you know, a step too far. Let's just stay where we are. And the people said no. So they secured their independence. And, you know, they said via Ian that the one thing that you must do when you become independent is to break everything. You know, break all the eggs and get on with what you want to change. Because within 2 years or so, the concrete will re-solidify, all the vested interests will re-establish themselves. And if you miss the chance of reforming the tax system, changing the land ownership system, you know, and all of these sort of things, you know, if you go beyond 2 years, you'll find it's impossible.
Great advice.
So that's been another problem with the SNP, that, you know, the point of becoming independent is to make changes. You know, the person in Easterhouse or Dundee or whatever who voted in 2014 for independence was not voting for independence because they wanted everything to just carry on as it was before. So you have to stop worrying about the sort of, you know, the middle class niceties of, you know, Collington and Newton Mearns or whatever, and tackle the issues. You know, what are we going to do about, you know, the educational attainment problems? What are we going to do about the poverty in large areas of, well, both rural Scotland and urban Scotland. Where's their vision for doing something about these? Because it is going to upset some people. You know, if we turn round and say that we're going to break up the big estates and we're going to force them to sell off the land and so on. The Scottish Landowners Federation, who are probably 99% Tories, are going to be up in arms, and they'll spend money with whoever they can to try and block it and disrupt it, and there'll be a big stoogie. And unfortunately, the way that politics work is normally the case that those who are going to lose something make 10 times as much noise as those who might gain. So they often, the no change people manage to win the argument simply by all the shouting that they're doing. I think that's where we are. I think the political situation, regardless of the difficulties of the SNP, could change very quickly. I think the Labour government in London is going to have a rather torrid time, because at the moment they have no vision and they have no plan for how they're going to deal with the economic difficulties of the UK. Those could blow up nastily at any time. I remember 1989, in August 1989, we went on with Edinburgh University's Scottish Country Dance Society to a folk festival in Czechoslovakia when it was still a communist state. And it was one of these sort of East Bloc festivals that we went to do, to demonstrate Scottish country dancing. My wife and I had no idea in the start of August 1989 that the USSR was going to have collapsed 2 months later.
That's the power of Scottish country dance.
Are you going to do a wee demonstration for us?
Can I just ask a quick question? Just, you mentioned there the Labour Party and Rachel Reeves. There's nothing that she's said so far that has made any sense to me in terms of somebody who runs their own economy and owns their own bank. Do you think that she either doesn't know what she's talking about, or is she being dishonest, or what's going on? What's going on down there? What's all this household economy stuff, and we can't afford this and we can't afford that?
I think she's a Tory. She's just following the Margaret Thatcher nonsense about, running a country's like running your own domestic house. You get so much in your wage and you've got so much to pay out, where totally ignoring the power of having your own central bank and treasury, where you can actually create money, as the UK government did. 400 billion to bail out the British banking sector in 2008. And another 400 billion of new money, quite rightly, to actually get us through COVID. It's totally different. And Rachel Reeves' policy of austerity will, as Tim quite rightly outlines, is taking us nowhere. You're not going to create jobs out of a policy of austerity. And does anybody seriously think that if the Labour Party had announced during the run-up to the election that the first thing we're going to do is to remove the winter heating allowance from 1 million Scottish pensioners, do you think the Labour Party would have won all the seats in Scotland? I don't think so. I mean, it was absolutely, totally dishonest. And then now, of course, this week you've had Ian Murray, the Secretary of State for Scotland, announcing that the 160 million that could have funded the winter fuel allowance for Scottish pensioners has been diverted to the Scottish office, and he's going to have 150 million of it to dole out directly, bypassing the Scottish Parliament, to areas of deprivation in Scotland to make the Labour Party look good. But in many ways, though, I mean, in Ulster, the Unionists in Ulster often requested that Ulster, because it could not operate, it be taken over for direct rule from Westminster. This policy of Labour, they're going to pass new legislation so that the Scottish office can bypass the democratically elected Parliament of Scotland and impose on Scotland direct rule.
It's just outrageous watching what they're doing at the moment. Yeah. I mean, just to sort of come back to where we started, I'm fascinated now to see what the Welsh guy says, because it seems to me that if you think about the three bits of the UK, other than England, that are all having constitutional conversations with ourselves, I'm just starting to think that Wales might be the first one to make it out.
Or Wales and Northern Ireland might be and then we could. Yeah. That's all right, as long as we actually do follow them. That's all right. Don't mind that. But
well, I think the other factor is, if I'm quoting correctly, I believe that the deputy leader of the Reform Party, and remember the Reform Party now in England is polling ahead of the Conservative Party, so they could be the actual next UK parliamentary party. In fact, they could be leading Westminster, but the deputy leader, not Nigel Farage himself, who thinks the Scots are very racist because he had to hide in a pub in Edinburgh once. but his deputy has gone on record to say that if Scotland has the audacity to continue to look for independence, he's going to deploy the British Army into Scotland. 4 or 5 years down the line, in the UK, we could get a Reform, ultra-English nationalist Reform Party as the government of the United Kingdom, and considering putting the army in to put us back in our box, just like they did after Culloden.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, the thing, I was really shocked. Well, I was shocked by lots of things in that general election, but I really was shocked when I learned that in Scotland, Reform got about 7% of the votes. Now, of course, that's nowhere near enough to get a seat when it's first past the post. But I immediately thought, well, if that happens in the next Holyrood election, we will have Reform MSPs because they'll get in on the list. And I really do find it shocking.
I don't want this taken the wrong way, but living in a rural area in Scotland, I mean, there's a very, very significant percentage of population are actually retirees from our southern neighbour. So it doesn't surprise me too much that you get Reform support in Scotland, because they feel very British.
Yeah. Do you want to tell people how they can get tickets for your conference? Because now you've sold it so well, we're gagging to get.
You sold it to us, definitely.
You sold it to us. So tell people how they can get tickets, how they can come along.
Well, it's very easy. I think most people are familiar with Eventbrite, or certainly a lot of people are familiar with Eventbrite. So the tickets are available on Eventbrite. If you go to eventbrite.co.uk and if you search for Scottish Currency Group, Currency Conference, anything like that, you should get it come up straight away. So it's an in-person ticket is £30 for both days. If you want an online ticket, then that is £10. If anyone who has an in-person ticket finds that it's not convenient to be there the whole time, they can have an online ticket for free as part of the getting the in-person one. So if you wanted to do Saturday in person and then just watch online on Sunday, that's perfectly possible within the 2-day ticket. There is the option of taking part in the buffet on the early on the Saturday evening, which is an extra £20. Also, perhaps just worth mentioning that there will be various other groups who will have tables in the foyer. So people like Commonweal, the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, and others will be present as well.
Excellent.
Well, all I'd like to say to the movement is that we are still here. We're providing leadership. We're positive. It's business as usual as far as we're concerned. The current problems with SNP, well, that's for the SNP to sort out. We're doing our bit in the Currency Working Group, Bank and Finance. It's
very clear talking to both of you this afternoon that positivity is there, and there's a sense of momentum actually comes through, and it's really great chatting to you. I've really appreciated it actually, and thanks, and fingers crossed it all goes well in Dunfermline.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you find that interesting. We'll put the link to the conference tickets in the notes to this podcast, and hopefully we'll see you there. We'll be back again next week with another Scottish Independence podcast.